It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's FT3 ACCESS series panel conversation entitled Rapid, Efficient, Adaptive: Can Innovative Health Technologies Meet HTA Evidence Requirements? We will be going through some of the concepts today that define HTA nowadays, and we will also dare to look into the future, especially with respect to a growing trend of personalization in the health sector. Moving to the next slide. My name is Vincent Raske. I'm an Associate Program Director at FT3, or From Testing to Targeted Treatments, hosting you all today. I'll give you a quick introduction around FT3's efforts to foster collaborative learnings, sharing spaces, and then hand it over to the panel to discuss today's topic. You will also all have the opportunity to ask questions towards the end of this meeting. In the meantime, I ask you all to please mute yourselves. Please note down the questions that come up throughout the panel conversation. Feel free to use the chat function as well to drop your questions there. And if not, when the Q&A opens, you will also have the chance to raise your hands and speak up and ask your questions directly. And then finally, we'll conclude together and reflect a little bit on the session today. So moving on. The FT3 ACCESS workshop series today hosts its very first panel, and the series was brought to life for advancing collaborative efforts for patient access to precision medicine. Together, we want to pave the way for a future where evidence-based precision medicine is accessible to all patients who could benefit. And for that, we are counting in the series on expert learnings, on discovering and enacting systemic change opportunities together and working to build capacity across different stakeholder groups. Today, we will focus on our experts on the panel who will share their perspectives on navigating the complex HTA landscape, including HTA processes, policies, evidence requirements, and stakeholder involvement in value assessment. Next slide. And this complex HTA landscape is a landscape that is built on the assumption that there is a clear picture of what evidence is needed to inform access decisions. But the reality is much more complicated, especially when it comes to precision interventions that target subpopulations, because they deliver something different, often not up to the standards of evidence that are required by HTAs, and leaving a gap that has real consequences for patient access. That's why FT3 is working to bridge this gap between HTA decision-making requirements and patient access needs. Next slide, please. We are working in FT3 towards a future where traditional HTA evolves as an adaptive, real-world informed evaluation of a health technology, so that all patients can have access to the right treatment at the right time. This includes exploring top-down approaches to shape the processes that govern HTA and bottom-up processes that enable more robust evidence collection. But this is a journey that we're on all together, and today's our first session of this year to help us better understand the growing gap between HTA evidence requirements and patient access to innovative health technologies such as precision medicine. Next slide, please. So we will, together with our panel, explore the tensions and opportunities in the HTA landscape, including the role of novel value elements such as productivity or adherence. We'll also listen to our experts around what barriers and enablers for strengthening value assessment exist and what changes are needed to make these approaches viable. That being said, and without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. I'm very grateful for Charles Alessi, the Chief Clinical Officer at Nightingale Health and a board member of the FT3 Alliance, who will be moderating today's panel with his background in digital health and health system transformation and personal personalized care from a clinical and a policy perspective. He is joined by Doreen Wong-Riga. Doreen is the president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders and also a board member of FT3, contributing her expertise in rare disease advocacy and patient-centered HTA from a global perspective. Wow. Kate Lockhart is our third panelist. Kate is a leader at the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, overseeing research initiatives, including the AMCP Research Institute, and contributing expertise in real-world evidence, managed care, and value-based access from a payer perspective. And finally, Daryl Pritchard is an independent personalized medicine expert, for a long time part of the Personalized Medicine Coalition, and most recently having served as a vice president for science policy. He brings expertise in precision medicine, policy, evidence generation, and value assessment from embedded within an innovation ecosystem. And with that, I invite Charles to take over from me and start the panel conversation.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and I'm delighted to be here. We have the next hour is going to be really quite interesting, and we will leave some time for some questions at the end. But let's really redefine this whole process of health technology assessments, because I think it will be helpful to reflect a little bit on the fact that I don't think we're in very novel territory insofar as what we're looking at today is the role of a regulator, of somebody who's trying to find a way to actually assess new policies, new processes, and ensure they're fit for purpose. And the fact that the world seems to be moving at a pace which is accelerating by the minute. And what used to take a year 20 years ago is now taking a month. And what used to take a month 10 years ago is now taking a week. And the last few months have been even more significant, I think, because change is now accelerating at ever greater pace. So I don't think it should be a great surprise that perhaps the assessment of health technology assessments has not moved with the times, because the times have moved very, very quickly. Certainly, we all started in a situation where health technology assessments were basically an academic assessment as to whether it made sense and whether it was safe, and really took, in the greater number of cases, a wholly population-based approach to determining whether something should or shouldn't be introduced on the basis that does it give value or not. But since then, of course, the world has changed. The world has changed. Oh dear, has the world changed? I mean, personalization of care, individuals' aspirations, the regrading and in terms of how important those things are have also changed, and the role of the consumer, of the citizen, of the patient is now far more important. Plus, also the new digital world, because real world evidence is real. It's there. It's there for the taking. Whilst at the time where people came up with these structures, real world evidence was not even the twinkle in the eye of somebody. It was so far away from thinking. So let's use our time as appropriately as possible, and really let's start the ball rolling by thinking in terms of what the panelists feel are the biggest points of divergence between the assessment needs of the innovative health technologies today and the realities of what they're trying to address in terms of the requirements of health technology assessments. Let's start with you, Daryl.
So thank you, Charles, and thank you to FT3 for inviting me to join this exciting and very impactful session this morning. Charles, you got to it in the introductory comments that the real challenge with health technology assessment, which is meant to really evaluate the value of different treatments so that we can make decisions regarding access to those treatments for the population. And the key problem here is that the process of health technology assessment is population-based. And as you mentioned, we are in a world where personalized medicine or patient-centered value is exceedingly becoming more recognized and important in these evaluations. And the health technology assessment processes that we have today just don't fit with that model. If you have a population-based assessment, it is designed to measure the average treatment effect for the entire population. And we know very well that there's great heterogeneity of treatment effects. That is, any treatment is going to affect one person differently than another. And we need to make sure that those patients where there is a very positive treatment effect, a very positive effect on outcomes, has access to that treatment, and that their value assessment is individualized, or at least the subcategory of patients that have that heterogeneity of treatment effect that is positive, that's assessed outside of the population average. It's absolutely key, or else patients that could have a very good, very positive treatment effect will not have access to that treatment because others might not have that effect. So this is our key challenge here. How do we consider individual-based value assessment in a population-based effort? Now, one of the things that health technology assessment groups will talk about it is that their job is to assess value for the population. What I'm suggesting is that we need to adjust that view so that individual level value is considered in that population assessment.
Very well put. And I completely agree with you. But we're going to hear more about that. I think Doreen would be perfect to talk now, considering where she comes from. Absolutely. In terms of rare diseases and personalization, where population basis has a completely different dimension. Doreen.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Daryl, for setting up the problem so well. So let me give you a different insight. We just came out of our one of our annual conferences here in Canada, where we had mind-blowing presentations from academic and clinical researchers who are doing work on almost what we call now N of one, very, very small, ultra-rare kind of populations, and creating cell therapies, creating custom-made gene therapies, and also, thinking about these as N of ones or N of a few. I also just recently came from a meeting where we're listening to what the Chinese are doing in terms of gene therapy. And the Chinese are, as we know, way ahead of the game. More gene therapy trials and more gene therapies being developed in China than anywhere. And their approach to it is going to be quite different, as you can imagine. One of the things we know is that, one of the companies that's very close to being able to bring forth their therapies is they want to do 100 gene therapies for this particular treatment in their Chinese patients, and then they're going to open up for medical tourism. Come to China if you have this condition and get your gene therapy. Now, they aren't worrying about HTA. Nobody's asking the question. And I want to ask the question, and Daryl, having you and Kate think about it as well. What if we didn't have HTA? What if life had started with N of ones? What if we had started with ultra rare and precision therapies? Would anybody have asked the question, geez, how are we going to get HTA to make these therapies available for a population? They're never going to go there. What we're trying to do with these N of ones and with these made in the academic, et cetera, environments is to be able to make them available for bigger groups. We need to get them in terms of being good for one to being fit for a bigger group and be good. It will be an incremental progression. A bit of the other end of the tunnel that you're talking about, Daryl. So I get the feeling right now with HTA, what we're trying to do is we're inviting the fire department in with their gigantic hoses to put out what might be a wastebasket fire. And we're saying, geez, how are we going to make this cost effective? How are we going to get them to get that hose into the house? We can't even find, we don't need it. And I think this is a very different approach. So let's start all over. And we've got some countries that have approaches, as you know, that are much more amenable to that, right? How do we take what is meant to be for a very specific population, small population? How do we scale it up now? I mean, the two questions, as you say, and I agree with Daryl, two things we're trying to get in terms of making these more available, skip HTA, is how do we make sure they're safe for a bigger, more diverse population? Because that N of one, that N of a few, we're going to try to make them more available, and sometimes in gene therapies for a population for which it was not exactly designed. And secondly, how do we price them? Right now we're pricing them at $5 million, $7 million, even on an N of one, right? I mean, if you walk into a hospital, certain kids in Toronto, you say, I'd like to have a custom-made gene therapy. They say, fine, it'll cost you about $5 million. Okay, well, guess what? Off the shelf, gene therapies are costing somewhere around $4 million anyway. So I can start you with scratch and make it for you. No, it's not exactly that. But what I'm suggesting is let's start all over. Wipe the slate clean. Forget HTA. And let's think about how do we work with the problem we have at hand? How do we put out that, trash can fire? How do we make these therapies safer for a larger group and determine that? How do we scale up incrementally? How then do we decide how we're going to price it? And that will take a different kind of a system. I do not need a fire department solution to a problem which really is at a different scale. Anyway, that's my, and there are
Thank
countries
you.
that are doing it.
Thank you. I mean, this is a talk about putting a petard underneath the HTA. I mean, long live the HTA. The HTA is gone. We're talking about the wake of the HTA now. But I take a little bit of exception and a little bit of pushback that there is some role, perhaps, for a licensing organization. But let not me develop that. Kate, over to you.
Thank you for that. And I think this is is setting up a lot of the challenge that we're here to discuss today. And I'm coming at this from a U.S. payer perspective, which is, as we all know, kind of a different animal than HTA in any other place on the globe. And I think, as we have already heard, the situation is not getting less complex. The available treatments are not getting less complex. They're getting much more advanced, much more sophisticated, but our assessment of those things are not holding pace with that level of sophistication. And some of that is about the evidence infrastructure, where we are so focused on, we have such a legacy of using clinical trial data to assess everything, when clinical trials really are to assess the safety and treatment effect for regulatory purposes. It's really only one piece of evidence or one piece of information. And payers, at least in the US, and I think elsewhere, other areas, HTA is actually a little bit more advanced than it is in the US, because we're also facing this huge fragmentation in our healthcare. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of separate health insurers and health plans and payers, and they're all doing something similar, but also kind of different. And there's not a lot of consistency, and that makes it a lot more challenging. This I think really complex ecosystem that we're trying to address, a really complex system and complex treatments, and put it into this also fragmented and complex ecosystem, and we haven't kept up. So I think the big piece for me here is understanding the evolution of evidence, real world evidence. Charles, you mentioned this early on. There's tons of real world evidence. We're getting a lot more sophisticated in capturing that and in using it and in using it for analyses. But I think there's so much more, and especially when we're talking about rare diseases, a clinical trial is not going to be very informative for all of the things that we need it to be informative for. So I think there's the landscape of evidence evolution, and then the consistency and across the what is currently a really fragmented system.
Yep. I couldn't agree more. But let's start to try to help our friends who are actually responsible for HTAs globally and think in terms of what really are the core challenges for HTAs to adapt from the present structure, the present processes that they adopt at the moment. Back to you, Daryl.
So, this has been a very interesting setup to the conversation already. And one of the key things that I think has been pointed out, but has also been challenged by Doreen, is that health technology assessment processes are evolving. They're evolving as they need to be. They're not evolving fast enough to keep up with the pace of change in treatment technology and healthcare technology. But the other side of the coin is, should we throw out health technology assessment the way it's done now entirely and start from scratch, or should we continue to work to evolve it and adapt the current health technology assessment system to account for all of the personalization that we've been talking about? And there's a great question there. Now, one of the key things, and just to follow up on what Kate was talking about with real world evidence and understanding how to assess technology outside of just looking at clinical trial data in one data point, is, are there diagnostics, are there processes for treatment that physicians, clinicians can use to say, okay, here's a treatment that's working or will work for a patient, and here's one that's not. Early in health technology assessment, they didn't even consider the diagnostic when it was required. They just looked at the entire population, whether what the treatment effect was. They looked pretty much at long-term overall survival as an endpoint from the clinical trial data, and then said, your treatment here costs too much because you're not getting that much value out of it for the entire population. Things have changed, and now at least if there's a biomarker test that is included in the label for the treatment, for the drug, that will be part of the process. But there are many practice-based elements to treatment decisions and to treatment adjustments that are not accounted for in the health technology assessment process. Without a formalized way to include this real-world evidence, this practice-based evidence, we're missing a great deal of that value, and if the health technology assessment is being used for treatment decisions, it is impeding access to treatment that would help a great deal of patients. So we really need to start to think about how best to calculate or to analyze for the individual patient what works for them, and bring in this real-world approach so that the physician can provide access to that. There is a place to understand what the value of that treatment is, so that in an evolving world, physicians and patients are all aware of what are the options. But we need to account better for these real-world elements that can come into the treatment decision and into the treatment adjustment.
Again, I completely agree. And Doreen, clearly, you're in a world whereby clinical trials can never really cut the mustard for you, because inevitably, with those small populations, getting enough statistical significance and size and scale and power is an enormous challenge. Plus, the issue of individual or small group various rest of the population. Those ethical dilemmas are always going to hit us. But assuming we're going to assist organizations and structures evolve to where they need to, how would you suggest we move from where we are now to where we need to?
Yeah, thanks again. And I love conversations that actually force you to think while the conversation is taking place. So appreciate that very much, both Daryl and Kate, and Charles also for helping to put some perspective around it. So nowhere does anybody think that it's a great idea to do a small sample even a large clinical trials, and then say, okay, we'll give it to everybody and we'll see what happens. And we will take away the controls we had for this small group in terms of making sure it was safe and effective. And we'll just throw it out there and hope that, everything will land up. What we sacrifice in that, of course, is, we make it available if we know there will be people harmed, as Charles said. We know there will be people that are just going to not get it because they don't get diagnostics, they're not right for it. And we are willing to say, okay, well, too bad. Some of these people just get shaken out and we sometimes don't even know what happens. We don't need that large-scale solution to something like rare disease or precision therapies. Yes. We're already starting with a tiny population. And as Daryl says, they're highly heterogeneous anyway. And what the gap between a so-called clinical trial and real-world evidence, it should be zero. I'm already monitoring you. I'm already following you. I'm already setting it up. I already have a few dedicated clinicians that are actually doing this. So, if you look at, I'm just thinking again to the gene therapies for hemophilia B that just, have been just approved and funded in Canada. And those patient populations, the 50 that are in the clinical trials, are no different than the 20 that we're bringing in. They will be monitored and followed in exactly the same way. And we will make sure it's working for them. So, and again, when I move from, a CAR T therapy that's made in the lab for a small population, and I'm going to expand it to a larger one, I do need the regulator. I need to be able to follow that. Yeah. But I don't need to do it in the way that I would if I were developing a drug for, hypertension. It's not the same thing. So again, let's not try to retrofit something that was never designed for us and make a solution that works. We get it. We need to make sure it's going to work as we expand it. We need to make sure that there are good controls in place. We need to make sure that at some point we figure out how much we're going to charge for this, and we're never going to do it in a way that's going to be profitable or cost effective. So a lot of us are also fooling around with different kinds of mechanisms of, what does payment look like, right? And certainly, your big companies of the world are never going to look at these little therapies. Well, some of them do, God bless them, but, we'll never look at these therapies and say, I'm going to make profit out of it. I'm going to go back to my shareholders and look, I developed a drug for 200 people and it's becoming a blockbuster and you're going to make huge amounts of, payback on it. It's not that. So, and we're looking at different kinds of payment models. We're looking at different kinds of not-for-profit schemes, like Telethon, Italy. So I think we have to start with it in terms of getting solutions that fit what is emerging as an amazing field, an amazing opportunity, and nurture that. And yes, we have to do it in the context of broader systems that have other kinds of challenges. But think about it as an investment. Think about it as growing, sort of a new industry. So what are you getting as benefits? They're not just profit. You're getting benefits in knowledge. You're getting benefits in new technology. You're getting benefits in terms of new ways of being able to account value. So I think, again, clinical trial evidence and real world evidence in a small patient population in the precision therapy and a ultra rare disease is no different. And I think if we set up those systems, I would wager at the end of the day, if we did that for every single patient, even if what they have is a very common condition. My husband died of Parkinson's and cardiovascular disease. That kind of a personalized approach he had for Parkinson's was very different what he did not get for cardiovascular disease. Makes a real difference in terms of being able to fit kind of what works, right? As opposed to trying to get. It's sort of like, if your child has autism, do you throw them into the school and hopefully we can get the school to work around them and get other aides in and try to adapt the classroom and get that child to fit in? Or do we think about a specialized environment that's designed for autism and really give that child a chance to thrive in an environment in which they're going to be with everybody else that's sort of like them? I'm not saying one solution is better than the other. I know that our aims are the same.
Perhaps, Lorraine, what you're describing really is the tip of the spear here, because what you're saying really is that the small populations associated with rare diseases need to be treated not in a different way, but need to be handled somewhat differently. But then I would then say to you that perhaps the world of mass medicine, evidence-based medicine, where we're all the same, is something which doesn't exist anymore. So perhaps the differences between a rare disease and a less rare disease are actually becoming less important, because everybody in due course will have a wholly personalized health system around them. And that is the key. So what's true for rare diseases may well be true for everything else.
You say what I sometimes say, Charles, and I say to people, if you're very, very lucky, you will have a rare disease. Because it means I know exactly what you got, and we know exactly the ways in which we might treat it. So congratulations.
Well, what we really need and to consider and to follow up on Doreen's comments is we need to consider what the treatment options are and then involve the patient with their physician in that decision. And that's the key thing. Those options need to be available, and we need to have that conversation driven by the patient.
Yep. Kate, your take.
Yeah, so this is again, I also appreciate having a conversation that really makes you think the whole time. I think this is very much that. And one thing that I want to inject into this conversation is part of the purpose of HTA is to deal with limited resources. We have a limited amount of resources that we are not very good at admitting that we have a limit to our resources in the US, but we really do. And so I think about 10, 15 years ago when the hepatitis C treatments came out, this was a whole new paradigm. These were curative in a field that's affecting a lot of people that there wasn't anything curative before. And the price for a course of therapy was $82,000, $84,000. And now we look at $82,000 and say, oh, that's nothing, because we have $5 million treatments.
Yeah.
But it's cost effective. There's high value in it. It's curative, but it's not affordable. And so there's this balance here that HTA, I think, is it perfect? Absolutely not. Does it need to evolve? 100% yes. With all of these more considerations, because as the therapies get more personalized, as they should, and the treatment patterns where you have biomarker testing and you can really do a lot more informed treatment, but you also have to be able to pay for it in some way. And I talk to our payers, the US payers, and every one of them grapples with how to manage their patients with rare diseases, because they are these very expensive therapies, and they're extremely valuable. But also, people say, oh, it's a rare disease, so you may or may not have one, a person in your health plan that you even have to worry about paying the upfront cost. You'll get the downstream benefit. But then there's 7,000 rare diseases. And so the payers that I talk to in the US say we have about 20% of our member population has a rare disease. So when you start to put that math into the picture, it becomes a lot different. And what we're trying to do is put these really important personalized medicine concepts into a system that's not really set up to handle that, because of this resource limitation piece that we have to put into it, that I think is again kind of the origin of HTA, is to understand how to manage those resources for the broadest good as possible. But we are missing some of the individuality, and especially when we get into rare diseases or a lot of these precision medicine therapies that are emerging, that I think this is sort of the crux of the discussion, is that HTA doesn't really fit those, but we still have to, as much as we would like to have every person that goes into a clinic have a completely personalized experience and everything is made just for them, that's not realistic from a time, resources, money, like equity standpoint either. And so I think there's some challenges there that we have some opportunities. I don't think we have all the answers, but I think there's some issues to face in this broader sense.
So can I
Kate,
respond to Kate for a second? Because I think she's
please.
raised every time when she was talking throughout. Let me go back to Hep C. You know, if we had stuck with the traditional systems, a lot of people never gotten Hep C. What happens, what did happening in, I mean, a number of solutions, right? You have to have innovation solutions. Japan, which has a humongous hepatitis C population, there was no way because they have a closed drug budget. You know what they did? They created a separate budget. This is a budget just for Hep C because we got to get rid of it. So we're not going to take it away from the rest of it. What did the WHO do? A lot of the people with Hep C were people who were living in low middle income countries. They actually forced the companies who held the patents, knowing they were never going to sell into those low middle income countries, give that patent over, right? So we created generic versions of hepatitis C drugs right off the bat, treated a gazillion people. A very quick corollary, Charles, is in Canada, we agree. One of the problems is, and I'm not saying this is a great solution because we fight with it all the time, is that we have these drugs come in very high price for a few people, right? And we get from the drug plans, I don't have that in my budget. I can't bring them in. What we did was we just in this past, couple of years created a $1.5 billion rare disease drug strategy. We put a bunch of these highly innovative new rare disease drugs, including, about a third of them are rare, cancers. And for refractory non-responsive cancer patients, we put them into a special budget, recognizing we needed to create some headspace to get those therapies in. Give you a year, give you some time. Here's the extra monies. Bring those drugs in rather than keep people waiting. And then over time, we collect some of the real world evidence, demonstrate how well they're working. Get your budget set up so you can do that, right? So there are solutions to the problem, that actually do exist if we want to use the same treatment. And as you know, Kate, not everybody's going to have a need for highly personalized therapy. I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done with, very, kind of yeah, I talk about my husband having two very specific conditions, but he also, God bless him, had a whole bunch of other conditions that, very easily managed, with very common kinds of, as do most of us, right? So I get it, but make the solution fit the problem.
Well, I mean, here we have the start of a solution, perhaps, but the ethical issue, which is very real, I think, and it would be unwise of us to pretend it isn't there, is that healthcare has a finite budget. Now, in some countries, one has a state system or a Bismarckian, or there are different types of health systems globally, of course, but in essence, they all really manage on a finite budget. So clearly, a person who's going to need an inordinate amount of resource is going to have a significant effect upon the rest of the population because they're going to get less. I mean, there's only either if there's so much and somebody's taking more, somebody has to take less, unless, of course, one thinks of some innovative solutions. But I question as to whether that will be a temporary process. Yes, as treatments go through a temporary process of special funding, one will learn how to assimilate them within the system. But there'll always be new treatments, so there'll always be the need for these innovative solutions, because we're always going to be fighting in a world whereby the rights of the individual and the rights of the population are going to be at some point in conflict ethically, inevitably, unless we find the fount of eternal funds, which I don't think any of us have found yet. So I think there is an inevitability of that. I think our role is to try to propose solutions, which we heard the start of a solution here today. But Kate, what do you think about this solution?
I think it's a good solution. I wonder about sustainability. And so I think this is, if we are starting to get, okay, we have to have a fund to cover this rare disease, we have to have a fund to cover this set of diseases, we have to have another fund to cover these sets of diseases, then it becomes diluted anyway. And how do you prioritize those? Now, philanthropy is a great way to do that, certainly, and you can get a lot of traction that way. But is that sustainable? And then to say, well, then you just have to figure it out for your budget, we'll set it up for a year and get everybody started, and then then we're going to pass the buck to the payers, or the HTA agency, or the payer agencies, and then all of a sudden we have this problem that is now coming back. So in some ways it feels like a temporary solution to just cover the bill, basically. And I think this also opens up the question of what other kind of creative solutions can we come up with. And I know, like gene therapy, this has been a part of the conversation for quite a few years now, of what do we do? Can we have therapy mortgages and these other sort of different payment models, and and we're trying to increase efficiency with some of the more common conditions so we can improve the value there, and then maybe free up some of the resources, some of the money to go to these new innovative therapies. But it's also, the companies, it's easier to get them to give Hep C treatments to the low and middle income countries than it is to say, hey, you need to give every, the 200,000 people in the US who need this particular gene therapy, you just have to give it to them. The resources still have to come from somewhere.
Yeah. Darrell.
So, I'm really glad the way this conversation turned, because this is what we really need to talk about. It's some solutions to these resource challenges for which this health technology assessment process exists in the first place. So I couldn't agree with you more, Kate. This is what we need to really be focused on. And where I go for the solution is that the system, the way it is, considering that we're talking about resource management and making an assessment for whether a technology should be accessible in a world where there are limited resources, we need to make that assessment. We're using tools that can be very much improved. And what I think is missing is we're not getting the patient level value of these treatments as part of this population assessment. Part of that problem comes with the primary measure that is being used, and I'll admit I use it as well, the quality adjusted life year measure. And that's a population assessment looking at clinical trial data to say here's the value of the treatment that we can afford, that should be paid for this treatment based on the clinical value that it provides. And that doesn't consider diagnostic tools, biomarker testing, doesn't consider other value elements that patients may have, like an increase in productivity, a decrease in downstream progressive hospitalizations, accessibility for a patient. It doesn't account for things like that, which can only be assessed with real-world practice-based evidence. And we need to fix that. So when we're talking about solutions, Charles, we need to fix that quality adjusted life year measure to include multi-criteria and individual patient level value indicators. Now that's a challenge. And Kate, I know you'll back me up on this. It'd be great, Durain, to say, well, this works for N of 1. Let's make sure that N of 1 gets it at whatever price is charged. But this isn't the world we're living in. We're saying, okay, we need to make large term or large population assessments. Yes, we want to evolve the tools and the measures that are involved, but we can't just provide access to everything, or we can't assess that we should provide access to everything without a more concrete system in place. And I think that's where we're going for solutions, is let's improve the measures that we're currently using to include patient level value indicators.
So we have two basic pillars here, which we've already uncovered. One is around setting up a temporary process whereby new treatments are introduced in systems using dedicated funding for a short period of time until they're assimilated into the system, host stream. And the second is let's look at what are measures which were based wholly on population-based solutions to actually encompass personal-based solutions. So I think we're on the way here. Before we go any further, though, I'm looking at the clock, and we've only got 12 minutes left. So I think, if I may, I'm now going to open.
No, let me respond. I have to
No, hold on a
respond to
second,
Daryl.
Doreen.
Okay.
Just hold on a second. I'll come back to you. Let's
Okay.
open the chat to questions, so people can ask questions on the chat, and I'll take them up. So if there aren't very many questions, we'll continue on our conversation, which we're going to continue now. Doreen.
Okay, very quickly. I think the challenge is we're trying to do three different things. We're using one tool, right? Number one, there is the question of how well does the therapy work? And if it's working for one population, how well does it work if we try to expand it? That makes sense on one clinical trial. The second question is what should we pay for it? What is the value? And that's kind of where the quality came in. And the quality, we remember, was actually designed for cancer therapies as they come in. And we had things like, does it really slow the progression of cancer? Does it extend their life? So that was a different question. And if you, et cetera. So we all know kind of what that is. It doesn't work again when we start to talk about these small populations because we're never going to get, a side by side, a very, very expensive small patient population drug, which actually we have no comparators. I mean, I've got a therapy now which steroid was the only comparator. I've got a therapy now which good care was the only comparator, and it's coming in as a $2 million gene therapy. I will never give you a quality that makes any sense whatsoever, including the uncertainty of it, right? But the third question is important, but it cannot be conflated with this, and that is, from a population point of view, how do we do the most good for the most people? Well, in that case, you just throw out the rare disease people because they will never, ever be those most people. They will always be expensive. They will always be challenging if you're trying to spread your dollars as far as possible and everybody gets an equal share. Yes, we will bump those people off the end, and we decided not to do that. And I think it's important to recognize it. If we don't want to bump them off the end, we have to look at some other ways of accommodating. We will never have the qualities for them. We will never have the good population clinical evidence for them. And they will definitely never be the patients that are going to drive down your overall population health. So I'm sad to say, but that is the way it works. The same as it works for any other outlier group. We talk about disabilities, we talk about minorities, we talk about people who live in remote areas. All of those things are things that you cannot throw in and say, well, I'll use the same yardstick for you. And if you don't measure up to the yardstick, well, and I'm sure none of you are saying that callously. I'm just sort of saying that's kind of what the formulas work out to.
Well, I mean, we are moving into a world whereby we're actually asking those questions. I don't think any health systems have met to date has actually gone as far as say people who are going to cost more than 5 groats are not going to be treated. Or perhaps if that has happened, they've done it surreptitiously and they've done it without actually being quite open about the fact they're doing it. But clearly, this is a dilemma we're going to have to live with. And it's a dilemma for which there is no perfect answer. So I don't think we're looking towards a perfect answer. But other colleagues, do you have any other innovative ways to actually manage this process? Let's start with you again, Kate.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I'm thinking that I'm going back to what I brought up at the very beginning of this discussion is reevaluating what kind of data and what kind of evidence we're using. I think we need to open up that toolbox, if you will, to be a lot more accommodating. The quality is not meaningful in a lot of conditions, and it's sort of like the bad Q word in the US because we kind of don't use it. That's a whole other webinar, but I think just thinking about real world evidence, we've been doing a lot of work on that to get our payers comfortable and confident in using data from other sources other than clinical trials. And I think that is maybe a small step, but I think it's a step in the right direction where we can start to incorporate more of the patient experience data, more of the what really happens and for who is going to benefit the most for this and why, and what is the bigger picture here. And I think that's going to be an important evolution in assessment across the board.
Can I just add a little addendum, perhaps? And also, we understand once and for all, and quite openly, the fact that the classical double-blind clinical trials have limitations. They are the gold standard for a world which existed in the past, but they may not be the gold standard for the world which exists at present. I don't think I've heard people say that often enough. We talk about, oh yeah, I suppose we better add some soft measures. These aren't soft. They're very, very hard, the measures we're talking about, the real world evidence we're talking about. But, epidemiologists being what they are, bless them, and clinical scientists, and perhaps that's their role, of course it is, will continue on that line. There's a question which I'm going to ask the panel. What role should patients and patient organizations play in designing the alternative frameworks that are being described, not just as data sources, but as co-architects? I'm not going to ask Doreen that question because I know she's going to say absolutely, like I would say absolutely. But let's ask Daryl first.
Yeah, this lines up with exactly.
And thank you, William, by the way, for the question. William Lemons, thanks.
This lines up exactly with how I was going to respond to Kate's last comments too. So this was perfect timing for that question. How can we all get together? And I think that's the challenge. I think health technology assessment, both internationally in Europe, the Health Technology Assessment Organization, as well as ICER in the United States, are trying. They recognize the limitations of the cost per quality measure and the use of just clinical trial data. And they're trying to improve or at least consider ways to make some of the things that we've brought up here a part of this assessment. So there are actions that they're taking to do a better job to include real world and assess real world evidence. They're at least with ICER in the United States, they're bringing patient advisory groups in to continue the conversation with patients to talk about how to do this. But nothing has taken really root. And this is where the community comes involved, William. This is where patient groups need to be a part of it. When I say things haven't taken root, is we talk about new assessment methods, things that should be considered in assessment methods so that we can improve the methodology. And in some ways, what Doreen had kind of mentioned earlier is discard some of the really outdated methodologies and develop new ones entirely. We need to do that through a consensus approach. We have seen over the course of the last few years more and more attention being placed on multi-criteria decision analysis that includes some of these things. I see that Rick Chapman is on the call. He's been a big part of trying to develop some of those multi-criteria analysis methodologies and new methodologies. Lou Garrison on the call as well. But we need to have a community approach to that. If we continue to say, here's the perfect thing, here's what, while we contrast that with another group saying, here's what we need, we can't accommodate your perfect methodology, we're never going to get anywhere. And what happens is we default back to the cost per quality. I've used it, I'm a evangelist for personalized medicine, and I've used the cost per quality in my publications because that's what is recognized. So if we're going to recognize something as community, that's where we need to go. We need the community to be involved, to get together, maybe through FT3, to come to consensus with how these methodologies need to be improved.
Thank you. Kate, beat that.
I think this is essentially important, and I think there's become a lot more interest and a lot more dedication to making sure that patients are at the table. William, you were asking about how our organizations have worked with patients and patient advocates. And I'll highlight one is that at AMCP, the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, we're working deliberately on how to incorporate patient experience data into payer decision making. There is some inertia to overcome here, because again, as Daryl was saying, we're sort of changing the paradigm a little bit and changing what we're discussing and with whom and how. But I think the whole point of healthcare is patients, right? That is the only reason we have healthcare, is to take care of patients. And so I think we've done a good job of forgetting about that for the last several years, but I think we're starting to do a better job about remembering that as part of that. That's really an essential part of the discussion.
Okay. And your final statement before I pass on to Vincent. Doreen.
So I love William's last question, and that is, how well has it been done? And I'll give you an example. Just at breakfast this morning, I'm sitting next to one of the leads at our HTA agency, and I'm telling this because she knows that we're really very frank with each other. So we were really part of the whole developing real world evidence frameworks with the HTA agency. Our organization and me, I'm sitting there as a co-designer on it. We created the best guidelines in the world for what real evidence needs to look like. How do you build it from the patient registries? Just this past couple of months, they're now designing the first really real world evidence protocol for a drug that's on our common list. And guess what? They didn't include the patients or the patient organizations. They designed it with a whole bunch of other and we came back and said, where are the patients? And they came back and said, we'll do a consultation. I just said this morning again, if you want credibility, to put first and upfront. Don't get everything designed, then say, okay, then we'll bring in the patient advisors. It's too late. Bring us into the table, bring us in up front. So the asset thing is, we were there to build the frameworks, William. We weren't there to implement them.
Good. What a way to end the conversation. Over to you, Vincent.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thanks so much, Doreen, Kate, and Daryl, for a very, very insightful conversation. I'm going to launch a quick poll for our participants to let us know how they have enjoyed today's session. Please fill this out. It's an easy assessment and multiple choice question. But yeah, in addition to that, this is the first of a series of conversations that FT3 is hosting. I'm very grateful to our panelists today for having shared their perspective. It is certainly a beginning. There is much work to do in addition to what is already ongoing, as we have heard. And as Charles summarized, two of the approaches discussed today are to look at temporary processes for patient access to precision medicine, and of course continuing to work on enlarging the measures that are being incorporated within value assessment to fully capture the value that precision medicine is providing to patients, and beyond that to society at large. You have many more opportunities to connect with FT3 throughout the next months. In the summer, we'll take a little break, and in October, we'll be back again, as you can see on the slide. Please connect with me directly or with the FT3 team more broadly if you want to get involved and move from conversation to action, which is what we're aiming to do together. So thank you all once again for your participation today. Thank you, Kate, Daryl, Doreen, and Charles for the panel conversation. And I look forward to staying in touch.